Hi everyone, welcome to or welcome back to my channel, and I hope you had a wonderful week. I was a bit ill last week, so I apologize if the voice is a bit hoarse or croaked, probably is like that anyway, but I hope that everyone is doing well. The last time we spoke about the case of Charlene Jooste and how scary it is that the people that you love can turn on you very quickly. And sadly, we don't actually know those closest to us, and it can have horrific endings. And if you haven't seen that case, I'll link that up here for you. But for today's case, it is terrifying for two reasons. One reason being that the person or people who did this are still out there. The second point as to why this case is so terrifying is just the blatant disregard for her life, her body, and how the people who loved her were going to find her, and no shame for what they did. And it is very obvious that a lot of people want justice for the victim, and we really hope that she does get it in the end. But with that being said, let's get into
intended for mature audiences only.
For today's case, we are heading to Pretoria, where on the 18th of July 1993, Anika Smit was born. Her parents are named Charlotte and Johan Smit. Anika was an only child. She had a strong bond with her parents, and they loved their daughter very much. Even though they loved Anika, Charlotte and Johan decided to separate when Anika was 13 years old. This was difficult for Anika, but she continued to have a really strong relationship with both of her parents. Anika had a strong passion for animals and would often be found at the zoo, where she would volunteer a lot of her time. Anika decided to stay with her dad in Pretoria, as this is where she grew up and a lot of her friends were, and she just knew the area. Anika was said to be very sweet, gentle, and incredibly bubbly. But as she started to grow up and become a teenager, of course her personality started to change. She was always sweet and gentle and bubbly, but there were other aspects that she was investigating about herself. She was learning about new things and wanted to explore more parts of her personality. Anika would experiment with hair dye, and as a natural blonde, she often dyed it black, and she would paint her fingernails black, and that was her style at the time. Now, I do just want to hop in here and just add a little bit of note, is that Anika and I grew up around the same time. She's only a year older than me. So I do remember the period of between 2012 to 2016 was quite, I wouldn't say the emo stage of a lot of life, but I know Avril Lavigne was very popular earlier in the days, and her whole punk rock tomboy kind of style was really popular. I did try it for a little bit, but it didn't suit me at all. But I do understand being a teenager, growing and shifting and trying new things and experimenting. And this is kind of where Anika would naturally gravitate more towards. She liked her hair being dark, she liked her fingernails being black, and she would wear alternative clothing. And also with Anika, like most teenagers, she started experimenting with alcohol and cigarettes, but she was said to drink quite a lot, and she would often be at the parties underage at the time. So then, on the 10th of March 2010, when Anika was 17 years old. Now, to give context into 2010, this was the year that South Africa was absolutely buzzing. This was the year of the Football World Cup. They were coming to South Africa. Everywhere was preparing for it. Restaurants were preparing. Everyone was excited to have all of these international names where a lot of people looked up to these football players. They were all coming to South Africa. A lot of foreigners would be coming to South Africa. It was just a buzz. And people were gearing up and getting really excited for this to happen in around June of 2010. So this was the buzz happening in that year, and there was a lot to look forward to. But that is besides the point. So on the 10th of March 2010, Anika, 17 years old, was at home ill. She thought that she had a really bad sinus infection because her nose was blocked, her ears were really sore, and she had a really scratchy throat. So on this day, Anika's dad, Johan, did say to her, why don't you just get dressed in your school uniform? If the doctor gives you a sick note, we can then take you back home and you can get undressed. But if he says, no, you're fit to go to school, then I can just take you to school. Because Johan had quite the drive to get to work, so he didn't really have time to wait for her to go back and get dressed and then go to work, if that is what the doctor suggested. So Johan then took Anika to the doctor, and he did actually book her off for a couple of days with a really serious ear infection. Because Anika then got the sick certificate, Johan then dropped her off back at home, and he said that he would then call the local pharmacy up the road, and he would try and get some medicine delivered to her around midday, and that she must just be aware of this, that they would eventually be coming to the house. So then Anika is at home, Johan is now at work, and around 9 a.m. Anika then calls her mom. Usually they wouldn't talk during this time because Anika would be at school, but because Anika was sick, she decided to talk for a few hours to her mom, and they just chatted about life. And sadly, this would be the last time that Charlotte would talk to her daughter Anika again. So Anika's at home. Around 9 o'clock, she talks to her mom. Then Around 12 p.m., like her dad said, midday, I'm going to try and get the pharmacy to deliver some medicine. Bang on, around 12 o'clock, the pharmacist driver comes to the house. He doesn't get out of the car, but he honks his horn a couple of times. And the reason he didn't get out of his car was that because near to the house, even though he would have been fine, he noticed that there was a side gate with really big dogs behind the side gate, and he was petrified of dogs, I assume, but he didn't get out of the car. He honked his horn and no one came out of the house. So remember these little bits of information. So 9 o'clock, mom, 12 o'clock, pharmacist, dogs locked in a side gate by the house. So because no one came out, the pharmacist's driver then called the pharmacy. They in turn then called Johan. Johan in turn then called Anika, and no one then answered. Johan just thought that maybe Anika was asleep. She was really not feeling well, and he just said to the pharmacy, it's fine, I'll collect it on my way home. Don't worry about it. So the pharmacy's driver then leaves on the 10th of March 2010 at around midday. So this case is wild because there are so many people who came forward. There's so much information, but like I said right in the beginning of this video, no one, as far as we are talking right now, has been charged with Anika Smit's murder. So I'm giving you a rough timeline. I remember mom, 9 o'clock, 12 o'clock for the pharmacy's driver, and then a neighbor would later testify that at 1 p.m. she noticed a blonde girl pushing a pram who looked like Anika Smit from the back walk up Anika Smit's driveway towards the house, and she said that she saw the dogs at the side of the house behind this like alleyway behind a fence at 1 o'clock. I don't know where this fits in because I don't know why Anika would be pushing a pram, but this is just some information to keep in the back of your mind. So with this information, the police would then assume that what happened to Anika happened between 12 p.m. and 2 p.m. on the 10th of March 2010. And police could only do this based on the evidence that they found inside the home and what evidence was missing from the home that we would get into now. So far we've spoken about this timeline. I've drilled that into your heads. Now let's get into the evidence that we find inside the home. So we know that Anika was alive at around 9 a.m. because she was still talking to her mom. However, after this, it seems like Anika had a visitor because when we look at the crime scene, there are 2 mugs of coffee or tea that are on the table and they have not been drunk. So it seems like as soon as Anika placed these mugs down onto the table, all chaos broke loose, and that is when disaster happened. So before we get into disaster, let me first digress. We have a lot more information to unpack. So firstly, remember I spoke about the big dogs that were on the side when both the pharmacist and the neighbor saw them. So the reason that Anika would put these dogs on the side of the house is because some people, when visiting the Smit family or Anika or Johan, often were intimidated by these dogs. They were reported they could become aggressive sometimes because they weren't used to strangers, or like some dogs, they just don't like to be put in certain circumstances, be that with noisy people, and owners generally know their dogs very well. So it seems like Anika got a visitor after her phone call with her mom. She then put the dogs on the side of the house, like an alleyway, where there's a gate that she could then lock the dogs behind. So the dogs were put away, and this person clearly did not like the dogs, or they put the dogs there for a reason. Like I said earlier, Anika then went into the kitchen and she prepared 2 mugs of coffee or tea. Once she then puts that kettle down and she brings those mugs into the lounge and places them onto the table, all hell broke loose. It seems like there was a massive fight for life in this home. The dining chairs were all pushed over. There was blood on the walls where it looks like she tried to get up. She was pushed against the wall. There was blood everywhere. And everything had been tipped upside down, but nothing had been stolen. So everything that had been tipped upside down was a fight for life. So someone went into this home knowing exactly what they were going to do, and they knew exactly the outcome that they wanted to happen to Anika. So with some of the crime stories that we speak about, the victims are left in really disturbing positions some of the time, where there is an intent for people who find them to realize that they are left in these positions for specific reasons that only the killer would know. So if we get into Anika and how her body was found, remember she only lived with her father at the time and Johan was at work. So when Johan came home, who absolutely loved his daughter with every fiber of his being, when he walked into that home and he saw that everything was a mess, the dogs were locked in the side of the house, and he walked into this absolutely silent house. I cannot imagine the absolute horror and gut-sinking feeling that he must have felt. He walked into this home, He called out for Anika and she never answered. He knew that Anika was there alone at home, incredibly ill, and the more that he noticed the blood, the more that he noticed the chairs and everything tipped over on the floor, his heart sunk even more. Johan then opened the door to Anika's bedroom, and there she was lying on her back, face up, and completely naked from the waist down. There were reports that a bottle or something was inserted, and her body seemed to be positioned in a way that was intended for extreme shock value. Anika had been stabbed and raped multiple times, and her throat had been slashed. So this murder was extremely violent. They went in there with full rage and wanting to kill Anika in the most violent way possible. And just as a reminder, she's only 17 years old. Being 17 is incredibly young, and technically she's still a child. Not only did this person go into Anika's home knowing that they were going to murder her, stab her multiple times and then slash her throat, they also did an absolutely horrendous thing by taking both her arms and cutting both her hands off between the elbow and the wrist, so around here, and they cut both hands off like that, and her hands to this day have never been found. So when the doctors would later go into this and have a look at the incisions that were made on Anika's arms, it looked like it was maybe done with a hunting knife. They basically hacked away at her arm. So then on the 20th of March 2010, Anika was laid to rest. So many of Anika's friends, schoolmates, family all attended her funeral, and people were absolutely devastated. Up until her point of her funeral, there were absolutely no suspects. Police did have DNA. There was a lot of evidence left at the scene, but it matched no one so far that they have found. And Anika's parents would hound the police. They wanted to know what information they had, constantly emailed them, they constantly called them, they constantly checked on any new leads, what was happening, and they wanted to make sure that Anika's killer was brought to justice. A local businessman, along with Anika's uncle, would put forward a reward for information offered that would lead to the capture of Anika's killer. Serious police detectives were put on this case, but nothing was happening. But not only did they not know what was happening, they didn't know really what to look for. They know that Anika had been sexually assaulted. They know that she had been stabbed, and they know that a knife was used, probably a hunting knife, but they didn't really know what type of person they were looking for. Then Gerard Labuschagne was approached to create an offender profile. And Gerard Labuschagne is a forensic and investigative psychologist, and he is incredibly well respected. So this killer profile was created because they didn't know who they were looking for. And these profiles are used for police officers to understand what type of perpetrator they're looking for. These profiles would also help detectives understand the motives and reasons as to why a killer would do this. So the profile came back believing that this crime was committed by someone who was known to Anika. It might not be romantic, it might not be friendly, it might even be an acquaintance, but they were known to Anika. The level of violence and sexualized nature of the crime scene, coupled with the position that Anika was found in, all pointed towards an existing knowledge or relationship between Anika and the offender. And it is assumed that the person or the perpetrator who murdered Anika had a very strong emotional connection to Anika. Maybe it was only felt by the offender, but there was a strong emotional connection, and that is why the crime was so violent, because there was so much passion and anger going into this murder. So now I'm going to get into the suspects, and there are quite a few. And like I said, because this case is still ongoing, everyone that we're going to talk about is innocent until proven guilty in the court of law. So like all crimes, especially crimes with passion, the first offender we always look at is the loved one, the husband, the wife, or the partner. And that was, at the time, Anika's ex-boyfriend, Nico Venter. Nico and Anika started dating just 3 months before the murder. He was someone that she had met through mutual friends, and he was around 5 years older than Anika. He was 21 years old at the time that she was murdered, and he was working as a security guard at the Carousel Casino in Pretoria. In the beginning of Nico and Anika's relationship, for the first few weeks, everything was absolute bliss. They were totally in love, and nothing could go wrong with their relationship. But clearly that's not the case, because just 3 days before her murder, Anika and Nico broke up. Now, I don't know if this in particular is the reason that he was a suspect, but apparently the reason that Anika and Nico broke up was because Nico felt that Anika wasn't taking the relationship seriously. Like I said, she's 17 years old, he's 21, but he felt that she wasn't taking it seriously enough and that she was just making a joke out of it, but this was just his side of the story. But according to Anika's friends, the other side of the coin was that Nico was incredibly jealous, and whenever Anika would talk to anybody else, he would fly into a blind rage, especially if they were male, and that is probably the reason why Anika broke up with Nico, and not because she wasn't taking the relationship seriously. But who knows, we weren't there and we were not in this relationship. Nico did have an alibi for the time of her murder because he was at work the entire day, but he did mention to police that he was going to meet up with Anika later that day after work. But if we have to get further into this case, we need to talk about social media. As we know, social media can be pretty rough, but it can also be a place to express yourself and really get to be creative. But however, in 2010, when this murder took place, social media was still really in its infancy. It wasn't really as prominent as it is now. And those times were also a lot less PG, I would say. People would say what they wanted, really. Everything was kind of a joke, and people would just go rogue on social media. But however, social media was also a place where maybe you were found guilty by social media rather than in a court of law kind of thing. And because there was such a hype on social media, police did arrest Nico and he was given 10,000 Rand bail. He also received death threats from people. He had to pay this 10,000 Rand firstly, and he was constantly tormented months up until his trial. But then, in true South African style, on the 14th of September of the same year, when the trial was going to take place for Nico, the court said, well, actually, we don't have enough evidence. We don't have any evidence because the DNA found in and on Anika's body and around the house does not match Nico. He has a solid alibi because he works in a casino, and generally in casinos there may be 1 or 2 cameras, so he was pretty much on every single camera where in the area that he was working at the time of the murder. So he had a clear alibi, allegedly. And there'll be a lot of allegedly because, like I say, this case is still open. So this case really had no suspects. And what the court decided to do was to create an inquest. And an inquest means that basically they could talk to anyone they felt had particular information about the case. That could be anybody that they could bring into court and talk to if they felt that they could give information about this case that could lead to the perpetrator. It doesn't necessarily mean that everybody that they brought in were suspects, but they could be, but they believed that they had information pertaining to this case. So far we've had Nico, who was the ex-boyfriend. Then the court decided to bring in Anika's mother as another suspect / person who had a lot of information. So Anika's mother was pretty much pushed off of the list because she lived in Cape Town at the time. She was not even in the same province, and she had spoken to Anika on the phone hours before, and they were able to pinpoint the phone that she wasn't in the same province at the time. Then the court asked Anika's father, Johan, to come in and speak about the case. They wanted to know exactly what he saw when he walked into his house and exactly what he did, and they wanted to know to see maybe if he slipped up somewhere, and they wanted to make sure that he wasn't the one who did it. So if we go back to what Johan had experienced, he walked into this house, remember, absolutely silent, torn apart, blood on the walls, and then he walked into Anika's room where he then found his daughter lying on her back, naked from the waist down, arms cut off. It was an horrific sight for anybody to see. And then Johan panicked, he stumbled around, and he then ran to his next door neighbor who were quite good friends with Anika and himself. They lived there for years, so he knew his neighbor very well, and he banged on the door and he asked for help, and the neighbor came running. The two men then went into the house, but before this other man went into Anika's room, Johan said, hold on. Then Johan went into Anika's bedroom and he placed a towel over Anika's lower part of her body to try and at least preserve some kind of dignity of how the killer left her. Johan did try to call the police while he was stumbling in the home, but he wasn't able to reach the police. Some people say maybe he dialed the wrong number, and some people say that the police didn't answer, and both were pretty plausible. So the police started off pretty rocky with this case, with potentially not answering the phone in the first place. But not only that, they also brought Johan in and questioned him for 3 hours straight. By the 2.5-hour mark, Johan was absolutely livid. He was almost basically frothing at the mouth that he was so angry, allegedly, because he was telling him that he had an alibi the entire time. He wasn't there, he didn't do it, you're wasting time, go and find the actual killer and stop questioning me. He absolutely loved his daughter and was incredibly offended that he was even in this position. I do, on the flip side, understand that police need this important information that Anika's father may have seen. Maybe when he first walked into the crime scene, he noticed something. Maybe he saw something on Anika's bed, we don't know, but also 3 hours is a bit much. It was clear that allegedly Johan had an alibi. Johan also said, quote, "I'm trying to deal with the death of my child, and then I get this kind of drama. I don't know how to handle it. They intimidate you with these questions and shit, and what must I tell these people when they say I'm lying and talking shit?" End quote. Like we said earlier, Johan Smit absolutely loved his daughter. He spoiled her whenever he could, and he really would give Anika the world. So like I said, there were quite a few suspects that were questioned. So far we had Nico, mom, and dad. And now let's move on to some of Anika's school friends. Damien Treby was another suspect, and he was 18 years old at the time, and in his last year of high school. He was rebellious, but not that much different than most 18-year-old males at the time. Damien and Anika were quite friendly. They actually lived quite close to one another, and Anika would often walk home with Damien, and their friend groups would often hang out with each other, but it was unclear how close Damien and Anika were. Damien was a suspect because he was not at school and he was bunking at the time that Anika was murdered. He also had scratch marks on his neck a couple days after the murder, but when questioned by police, he said that he got this from his sister, who scratched him and said that it happened days after Anika's murder. But it could just be completely coincidental. But Damien's whole background and everything included with him was quite suspicious. And what made Damien quite the suspect was the messages that were found on his phone. And before I get into that, I need to reiterate that this was 2010, so Mixit was still quite the thing. And if you don't know what Mixit is, it was basically a messaging app that was created in South Africa, and it's kind of like WhatsApp or BBM, but really in its infancy. And you could basically put your status if you were in love or things were complicated, and because if your friends had you and your particular love interest on their Mixit app, they could see that if you put your status as complicated and then your love interest put their status as complicated, you were like, oh, something is happening and this is some drama. Mixit, you could chat to everybody and you could be included in groups, and just like WhatsApp is now. And also you could create your own username. So Damien, the suspect in this case, his username was Vampire. And I do just want to point out this is 2010, so it could be that he was just really invested in Twilight, or he had other reasons for it being called the Vampire. But Damien, aka Vampire, was also talking to someone known as Satan Eyes on Mixit. So that was their username, Satan Eyes. So the conversations went as follows between Damien and Satan Eyes. Damien said, quote, "Will you give me one ritual? I want to see a person dead. Do you have a ritual to kill?" End quote. Satan Eyes then replies and said, quote, "Okay, go to the graveyard, get some dirt, a shoebox, and an item from that person. Place all of these items onto a doll and visualize what you want to happen to that person. Channel all your hatred and bury it with sand and the shoebox in the cemetery. Bury the box and cover it with sand." End quote. So because Anika's body was found, these messages came to light, obviously. And as soon as this came out, social media was like, satanic rituals, this guy was into Satanism, and this is exactly what happened to Anika, the way her body was found, like this could be our guy. Damien denied it and said he had absolutely nothing to do with Anika's murder, and he also said that these conversations that happened on Mixit happened weeks to months before, and it had nothing to do with Anika. But we'll get back into that in a second. But inside Damien's room, books were found for a satanic cult, and Damien would say that yes, he did valuing Satanism because he said that people at school would often leave him alone then because they were scared of him and he wouldn't get bullied. So if we go back to the Mixed messages between Satan Eyes and Damien, Damien would say that these messages were done months before and was actually about an issue with his girlfriend's family member. His girlfriend was having some issues with her family, and he was then talking to Satan Eyes about his girlfriend's family member, not Anika. The girlfriend would also later testify that she was Christian, but she was incredibly interested in movies that involved occult and Satanism, and she absolutely loved Twilight. So I don't really know. These are all alleged. The texts weren't alleged. They are actually there. However, this interest between the occult and these mixed messages between Satan Eyes and Vampire or Damien, I do think that this is some kind of teenage interest. Yes, it might have grown now. I mean, they're adults. But Like I said, Anika was interested in a lot of things. We're all trying to experiment here as teenagers, and I think Damien and his girlfriend, being in the Twilight era, being in this weird mix of supernatural, just piques a lot of people's interests, and maybe they were slowly learning and getting into this. Not defending, just saying. So the court would then move on to Damien's snakes. And I do just want to pre-warn, I have very sensitive issues with animals, in the sense that if I see any animal injured, be that a bird, a snake, anything, I absolutely want to bawl my eyes out. So I don't really like listening parts where animals get hurt. So this is just a pre-warning. So Damien would have an incredible interest in snakes, and he would keep a lot of animals, cats, small dogs, and he would keep them and torture them, allegedly. He would take a scalpel and he would dissect these animals. Damien would also keep CDs of horror movies, very hectic music, and he would keep a lot of bullets in his room. But as for social media, Damien was their man, but he was not. His DNA did not match what was found in and on Anika's body. None of the blood in the house matched Damien's, and he said he had an alibi for the time as well. But Damien was bullied for almost 6 years on social media, and people believed that he was this guilty person and that all of this stuff was part of the Satanistic occult that he was part of.
Ek is uitgetyd as 'n satanist en moordenaar deur verskeie mense onder andere die media. Ek het vandag eendag ons my onskuld voorgehou en dit is nog steeds die geval. Ek het dreigemente ontvang en veral op Facebook waar ek skuldig gevind is deur die publiek. Ek was en is nog steeds onskuldig. Ek wil dankie sê vir die mense wat in my onskuld geglo het, my ouers, my familie, my vriende wat my ken. Ek hoop dat hierdie hoofstuk van my lewe nou afgehandel is.
So with this, another suspect was potentially ruled out, and that was suspect number 4. So we've got Nico, we've got mom, dad, and Damien. But just when we think all is doom and gloom, on the 17th of September 2015, a 25-year-old man walked into his local police station and confessed to the murder of Anika Smit. This man showed police that he was sober, coherent, and that he was not under the influence of any substance. He stated that he could not live with what he had done, and he wanted to take responsibility for his actions. He was then arrested, facing charges for the murder, rape, and mutilation of a corpse. The man who walked into the police station is a man named Smiley ScissorHands. Andre finished school until grade 11 and then attended a college. However, he did not complete his studies and was employed as an aircon technician. He lived with his parents in Pretoria North. Andre had a completely squeaky clean police record, and he was in no way associated to the case before he walked into that police station and confessed. He was quiet, friendly, and a young man growing up quickly. And because of his friendly demeanor, that is why he earned the nickname Smiley. And those who knew him said he was soft, cute, and that he didn't even fight at once in school. Because of his confession, he was placed under psychiatric evaluation, but at the end, he said he couldn't remember what happened at Anika's house and that he suffered from hallucinations. But after around 50 days in total under the psychiatric evaluation, he was found fit for trial. However, while in prison, he confessed a lot to his cellmate. Andre said that he had killed Anika, buried her hands in a special place, and he apparently also admitted that he cleaned the murder scene. He then proceeded to tell them that he would like to be called Smiley ScissorHands. He also allegedly stated that he wanted a tattoo of 2 hands dripping blood on his chest. But DNA does not lie. And just like before, none of the DNA matched that was found in and on Anika's body, the blood in the house, and any of that type of DNA. And because of that, Andre was like, oh, well, sorry, thank you, and I'm sorry for wasting everybody's time. But he did say that the reason that he confessed was because one night he was out drinking with his friends and they were having an absolutely good time, and he then went to this one bar, and while in this one bar he spoke to a couple. This couple then whispered in his ear that if he does not confess, they will kill him and his entire family, and that's why he needs to confess. Police did investigate the CCTV footage in that location and in that bar, and yes, there was a couple, and yes, they did speak to Andre. However, this conversation lasted less than 20 seconds. So I don't know how quickly someone can tell that they're going to murder someone in less than 20 seconds. So when it came for charges against Andre, the state disclosed that they didn't actually have any physical evidence against Andre, and that all the allegations of what he confessed to were from fellow prisoners and that were technically hearsay. and also his DNA didn't match. So ultimately the charges were withdrawn provisionally, and he was released on the 30th of August 2017. But remember that he was released provisionally. If in future they do think that Andre is possibly the murderer, he can be arrested at any time and brought back for the murder of Anika Smit. So the people that we mentioned so far were not the only people who came forward to talk about the murder of Anika Smit. There were so many people from Anika's school that came forward. One neighbor also said that on the day that Anika was murdered, at around 12 o'clock in the afternoon, she said that she was in the garden and that she heard a scream coming from Anika's house. She then was about to look over the wall when she heard her doorbell ring. So she then forgot about that. She hopped off the whatever she was standing on to look over the wall, and she then went inside. They spoke for a couple of hours and she completely forgot about the scream that she heard. And the reason that she said she never went to look at it again was because there was only one scream, and if she had heard another one, she would have then gone out to have a look. Someone from Anika's school named Angelique Funnikak came forward. Apparently these two were pretty close, they were very good friends, and apparently Angelique had known Anika since 2004. She described Anika as someone who was spontaneous and not withdrawn in the slightest. She said that she spoke to Anika the day before the murder, where they then chatted about the relationship issues she was having with Nico. She also mentioned that 3 weeks before Anika's murder, Anika had arrived at Angelique's farmhouse with an unknown man. She said that this man had dark hair and rode a Honda motorbike, and she only saw him twice. Once on that day at the farmhouse, and once again at Anika's funeral. So far has not been known and identified to the public. And while this was all going on with Angelique testifying, she then brought up somebody else, a man named Reno Brunk. And she said allegedly that Reno was interested in getting to know Anika on a more personal or intimate level. And Anika was not in the slightest but interested in Reno. Reno was apparently friendly or a good friend of Anika's ex-boyfriend, Nico. And so Reno is now the last person who's been added to the person of interest list. It has also been said that Reno has submitted 2 conflicting reports of what happened that day. So he is allegedly on the top suspect list for this case. And allegedly, and according to some articles, Reno was advised to seek legal representation, which is not that abnormal. You are potentially going to trial for allegedly being a suspect in a murder. So I would hope that someone would offer him legal representation. But then, sadly, in 2019, the murder of Anika Smit and the inquiry of her death was put on hold indefinitely. Nico, ex-boyfriend, mom, dad, Damien, Andre, ScissorHands, and now Reno all remain persons of interest in this case. A judge ruled that the matter would be back in court once everyone was able and ready mentally to continue. As of today, the case has not been continued and the murder docket is still open. Sadly, many of the dockets have gone missing, and they worry that those who were questioned earlier in the case, this evidence will be lost and they will not find this perpetrator. Sadly, to this day, no one has been convicted in the rape and killing of 17-year-old Anika Smit. Her hands have never been found, and unless someone comes forward with new information, Anika's case remains unsolved. The police have failed to pull together enough evidence to go through with prosecuting anyone for her death. But there is still hope that someday DNA evidence will match to someone, and hopefully not connected to another gruesome murder like Anika's. So let me know what you think of this case. I find it incredibly sad that Anika's case has not been solved. I do not think that it was someone off the street that Anika invited into her home without knowing them. I do believe it is someone that she knows, especially because she made them a hot drink and the dogs were put away. I think that if Anika had opened the door to a stranger, she would not have put the dogs away. I think personally that it is someone she knew and that she welcomed into their home, who then did the unthinkable. I don't know out of the suspect list or this person of interest list who it could be out of those 6. Let me know who you think it could be. Is there something bigger happening here that we're missing? Or do you think that there's someone who's not on this list that should be on this list that police haven't even thought about? Or do you think that one of these 6 is the murderer? I also find that tough because we don't know the outcome of the DNA for Reno yet, but we do know that the other 5's DNA does not match the DNA in and on Anika's body and the blood in the house. I assume that if the DNA matched Reno, maybe he would be on trial for it, but maybe they haven't even got around to that yet. Maybe all the evidence completely has been stopped and they're not going to look at anything until the trial continues and that the inquest continues for Anika's murder. I do find unsolved cases really difficult to talk about because I always want to know what happened, but there are so many unsolved murders out there, and there are so many families that are grieving that do not know what happened to their loved ones, and I think it is important to talk about them. But let me know what you think of this case down below. I hope that you're all doing well. Please stay safe out there, and I'll see you again next time. Bye.